want you to draw your own conclusions, Dr. Cross. He's right here in this section near the main ward. I would very much like your opinion." We stopped at a bolted steel door in the hospital corridor. A guard let us through. Beyond the door were a few more hospital rooms, but rooms for maximum security. A light burned brightly from inside the first room. It wasn't Siniji's. He was in a darker room on the left. The regular prison visiting area had been ruled out because it offered too much exposure. 2 guards with shotguns sat outside the room. "Has there been any violence?" I asked. "No, not at all." "I'll leave you two to talk. I don't think you have to be concerned about any violence. You'll see for yourself." Gary Siniji Murphy watched us from his cot. His arm was in a sling. Otherwise, he looked the same as the last time I'd seen him. I stood inside the hospital room. When Dr. Campbell walked away, Siniji studied me. There was no sign of recognition from this man who'd threatened to kill me when we'd last met. My first professional impression was that he seemed afraid to be left alone with me. His body language was tentative, very different from the man I'd wrestled to the ground at the McDonald's in Wilkinsburg. "Who are you? What do you want with me?" he finally said. His voice quivered slightly. "I'm Alex Cross. We've met." He looked confused. The expression on his face was very believable, too. He shook his head and closed his eyes. It was an incredibly baffling and disconcerting moment for me. "I'm sorry. I don't remember you," he said then. It seemed an apology. "There have been so many people in this nightmare, I forget some of you. Hello, Detective Cross. Please pull up a chair. As you can see, I've had plenty of visitors." "You asked for me during the negotiations in Florida. I'm with the Washington police." As soon as I said that, he started to smile. He looked off to the side and shook his head. I wasn't in on the joke yet. I told him I wasn't. "I've never been to Florida in my life," he said. "Not once." Gary Siniji Murphy stood up from his cot. He was wearing loose-fitting hospital whites. His arms seemed to be giving him some pain. He looked lonely and vulnerable. Something was very wrong here. What in hell was going on? Why hadn't I been told before I came? Evidently, Dr. Campbell wanted me to draw my own conclusions. Siniji Murphy sat down in the other chair. He stared at me with a baleful look. He didn't look like a killer. He didn't look like a kidnapper. A teacher? A Mr. Chips? A lost little boy? All of those seemed closer to the mark. "I've never spoken to you in my life," he said to me. "I've never heard of Alex Cross. I didn't kidnap any children. Do you know Kafka?" he asked. "Some. What's your point?" "I feel like Gregor Samsa in Metamorphosis. I'm trapped in a nightmare. None of this makes any sense to me. I didn't kidnap anyone's children. Someone has to believe me. Someone has to. I'm Gary Murphy, and I never harmed anyone in my entire life." If I followed him, what he was telling me was that he was a multiple personality. Truly, Gary Siniji Murphy. "But do you believe him, Alex? Jesus Christ, man. That's the $64 question." Scorse, Craig, and Riley from the Bureau, Klepner and Jesse Flanagan from the Secret Service, and Sampson and I were in a cramped conference room at FBI headquarters downtown. It was Old Home Week for the hostage rescue team. The question had come from Jerry Scorse. Not surprisingly, he didn't believe Siniji Murphy. He didn't buy the multiple personality bit. What has he really gained from telling a lot of outrageous lies, I asked everyone to consider. He says he didn't kidnap the children. He says he didn't shoot anyone at the McDonald's. I looked from face to face around the conference table. He claims to be this pleasant-enough nobody from Delaware named Gary Murphy. "Temp insanity plea," Riley offered the obvious. "He goes to some cushy asylum in Maryland or Virginia, Out in 7 to 10 years, maybe. You can bet he knows that, Alex. Is he clever enough? A good enough actor to pull it off? So far, I've spoken to him only once. Less than an hour with him. I'll say this. He's very convincing as Gary Murphy. I think he's legitimately VFC. What the hell is VFC? Scorse asked. I don't know VFC. You've lost me. It's a common enough psych term, I told him. All of us shrinks talk about VFC when we get together. Very fucking crazy, Jerry. Everybody around the table laughed except Scorse. Sampson had nicknamed him the funeral director, Digger Scorse. He was dedicated and professional, but usually not a lot of laughs. Very fucking funny, Alex, Scorse finally said. That's VFF. Can you get in to see him again? Jessie asked me. She was as professional as Scorse, but a lot nicer to be around. Yeah, I can. He wants to see me. Maybe I'll even find out why in hell he asked for me down in Florida. Why I'm the chosen one in his nightmare. Chapter 47. 2 days later, I wangled another hour with Gary Sinigi Murphy. I'd been up the previous 2 nights rereading multiple personality cases. My dining room looked like a carrel at a psych library. There are tomes written about multiples, but few of us really agree on the material. There is even serious disagreement about whether there are any real multiple personality cases at all. Gary was sitting on his hospital cot, staring into space when I arrived. His shoulder sling was gone. It was hard to come and talk to this kidnapper, child killer, serial killer. I remembered something the philosopher Spinoza once wrote. I have striven not to laugh at human actions, not to weep at them, nor to hate them, but to understand them. So far, I didn't understand. Hello, Gary, I said softly, not wanting to startle him. Are you ready to talk? He turned around and seemed glad to see me. He pulled a chair over for me by his cot. I was afraid they wouldn't let you come, he said. I'm glad they did. What made you think they wouldn't let me come, I wanted to know. Oh, I don't know. It's just, I felt you were someone I might be able to talk to. The way my luck's been going, I thought they would shut you right off. There was a naivete about him that was troubling to me. He was almost charming. He was the man his neighbors in Wilmington had described. What were you just thinking about? A minute ago, I asked, before I interrupted. He smiled and shook his head. I don't even know. What was I thinking about? Oh, I know what it was. I was remembering it's my birthday this month. I keep thinking that I'm suddenly going to wake up out of this. That's one recurring thought, a leitmotif through all my thinking. Go back a little for me. Tell me how you were arrested again, I said, changing the subject. I woke up. I came to in a police car outside of McDonald's. He was consistent on that point. He told me the same thing 2 days before. My arms were handcuffed behind my back. Later on, they used leg irons, too. You don't know how you got into the police car? I asked. Boy, was he good at this. Soft-spoken, very nice, believable. No, and I don't know how I got to a McDonald's in Wilkinsburg either. That is the most freakish thing that's ever happened to me. I can see how it would be. A theory had occurred to me on the ride down from Washington. It was a long shot, but it might explain a few things that didn't make any sense so far. Has anything like this ever happened to you before? I asked. Anything vaguely like it, Gary? No. I've never been in any trouble. Never been arrested. You can check that, can't you? Of course you can. I mean, have you ever woken up in a strange place before? No idea how you got there? Gary gave me a strange look. His head cocked slightly. Why would you ask that? Did you, Gary? Well, yes. Tell me about it. Tell me about those times when you woke up in a strange place. He had a habit of pulling on his shirt between the second and third buttons. He would pull the fabric away from his chest. I wondered if he had a fear of not being able to breathe, and where it might have come from if he did. Maybe he'd been sick as a child, or trapped with a limited air supply, or locked up somewhere, the way Maggie Rose and Michael Goldberg had been locked away. For the past year or so, maybe more than that, I've suffered from insomnia. I told that to one of the doctors who came to see me, he said. There was nothing about insomnia in any of the prison workups. I wondered if he told any of the doctors or simply imagined that he had. There was stuff about an uneven Wechsler profile, indicative of impulsivity. There was a verbal IQ and a performance IQ, both through the roof. There was a Rorschach profile that reflected severe emotional stress. There was a positive response to TAT card number 14, the so-called suicide card, but not a word about insomnia. Tell me about it, please. It could help me to understand. We'd already talked about the fact that I was a psychologist, besides being a really crackerjack detective. He was comfortable with my credentials. So far, anyway. Did that have anything to do with his asking for me down in Florida? He looked into my eyes. Will you really try to help me? Not trap me, Doctor? Help me? I told him that I'd try. I'd listen to what he had to say. I'd keep an open mind. He said that was all he could ask for. I haven't been able to sleep for a while. This goes back for as long as I can remember, he went on. It was becoming a jumble. Being awake, dreams. I had trouble sorting one out from the other. I woke up in that police car in Pennsylvania. I have no idea how I got there. That's really how it happened. Do you believe me? Somebody has to believe me. I'm listening to you, Gary. When you've finished, I'll tell you what I think, I promise. For the moment, I have to hear everything you remember. That seemed to satisfy him. You asked if it's happened to me before. It has. A few times. Waking in strange places. Sometimes in my car, pulled over along some road. Sometimes a road I've never seen or even heard of before. A couple of times it's happened in motels, or wandering the streets. Philadelphia, New York. Atlantic City one time. I had casino chips and a complimentary parking ticket in my pocket. No idea how they got there. Did it ever happen to you in Washington, I asked. No, not in Washington. I haven't been in Washington since I was a kid, actually. Lately I've found I can come to in a conscious state, completely conscious. I might be eating a meal, for example, but I have no idea how I got in the restaurant. Did you see anybody about this? Did you try to get help? A doctor? He shut his eyes, which were clear chestnut brown, his most striking feature. A smile came across his face as he opened his eyes again. We don't have money to spend on psychiatrists. We're barely scraping by. That's why I've been so depressed. We're in the hole over 30 grand. My family is 30,000 in debt, and I'm here in prison. He stopped talking and looked at me again. He wasn't embarrassed about staring, trying to read my face. I was finding him cooperative, stable, and generally lucid. I also knew that anybody who worked with him might be the victim of manipulation by an extremely clever and gifted sociopath. He'd fooled a lot of people before me. He was obviously good at it. So far, I believe you, I finally said to him. What you're saying makes sense to me, Gary. I'd like to help you if I can. Tears suddenly welled in his eyes and rolled down his cheeks. He put his hands out to me. I reached out and I held Gary Saniji Murphy's hands. They were very